You're a 12-year-old girl in the bustling markets of Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty. The silk merchants call out their wares while the scent of jasmine tea mingles with incense from nearby temples. Your mother holds your hand tightly as you weave through crowds of scholars in flowing robes and farmers hauling baskets of fresh persimmons. The capital feels alive, pulsing with opportunity and promise. Your father speaks of your upcoming betrothal to a merchant's son, a match that will secure your family's future. The wedding preparations have already begun. Red silk for your dress, gold ornaments for your hair. Everything seems perfectly arranged, a life mapped out in tradition and honor. Then you make a single mistake. Maybe you laugh too loudly at the wrong moment. Perhaps you accidentally brush against a male stranger in the crowded marketplace, or maybe you're simply in the wrong place when accusations fly about stolen goods or forbidden activities. In Imperial China, a woman's misstep wasn't just a personal failure. It was a crack in the cosmic order itself, a disruption that demanded correction through methods so brutal they would haunt dynasties for centuries. What you're about to discover isn't just history. It's a window into a world where a woman's body became the canvas for society's darkest impulses, where punishment wasn't simply about justice, but about sending messages that echoed through generations. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated, systematic, and designed with surgical precision to break not just the individual, but the very idea of female defiance. The Imperial Chinese justice system didn't just punish crimes. It engineered suffering. And for women, that suffering was crafted with an understanding of anatomy, psychology, and social hierarchy that turned punishment into an art form of terror. We're not talking about quick executions or simple imprisonment. We're talking about punishments that could stretch for months, designed to extract maximum agony while keeping the victim alive long enough to serve as a warning to others. Before we step into that world of calculated cruelty, we need to understand the foundation it was built upon. In Imperial China, women existed in a rigid hierarchy that determined not just their daily lives, but the very nature of their punishments. A peasant girl who stole rice faced different torments than a concubine who betrayed her master, and both experienced entirely different horrors than a noble woman accused of treason. The punishment wasn't just about the crime. It was about reinforcing exactly where each woman belonged in the cosmic order. The philosophy was simple, but devastating. Women were vessels, not individuals. They carried the honor of their families, the bloodlines of their husbands, and the stability of the empire itself. When a woman transgressed, she didn't just break a law. She shattered the invisible threads that held society together. And the response had to be proportional, not to her individual guilt, but to the magnitude of that cosmic disruption. Chinese legal scholars spent centuries perfecting what they called graduated punishment, a system where the severity of torture escalated based on precise calculations of social damage. They developed manuals, detailed guides that read like medical textbooks but described techniques for inflicting maximum psychological and physical trauma. These weren't the products of sadistic individuals, but of bureaucratic minds that approached human suffering with the same methodical precision they applied to tax collection or military strategy. The first category of punishments targeted what imperial authorities called crimes of the body. These were offenses where women used their physical selves in ways that challenged social order. Adultery, prostitution, or even being the victim of rape could land a woman in this category because in the imperial mindset, her body had been corrupted and needed purification through pain. The lingqi, known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts, was reserved for the most severe cases. But for women, it carried additional layers of humiliation designed specifically around female anatomy. The process began with public display, where the condemned woman was stripped and exhibited to crowds who gathered not just to witness justice, but to participate in a collective ritual of moral reinforcement. The cutting itself followed ancient patterns, starting with the extremities and working inward, each slice calculated to cause maximum pain while avoiding vital organs for as long as possible. But the lingqi was just the beginning. Imperial authorities developed punishments that specifically targeted female reproductive capacity, understanding that for women, the ability to bear children was often more precious than life itself. The crushing of pelvic bones was performed with wooden presses, applied gradually over hours or even days. The victim remained conscious throughout, watching her own body being systematically destroyed, while knowing that even if she survived, she would never again fulfill her primary social function. For crimes of the mind, where women were accused of sedition, witchcraft, or intellectual defiance, the punishments took on psychological dimensions that modern torture experts still study for their sophisticated understanding of mental breakdown. The water treatment involved forcing victims to consume massive quantities of liquid until their internal organs began to rupture. But the true torture was in the timing. Guards would stop just before death, allow partial recovery, then begin again. The cycle could continue for weeks, creating a mental state where the victim began to crave death while simultaneously clinging to hope. The bamboo cage represented perhaps the most ingenious fusion of physical and psychological torment. Women were locked in cages constructed from living bamboo shoots, which grow at a rate of several inches per day. As the bamboo grew, it would slowly pierce through the victim's body. But the process was so gradual that death could take months. The psychological component was equally devastating, as victims could watch their own slow impalement while listening to the bamboo creaking and growing around them. Imperial records, maintained with bureaucratic precision, document thousands of these cases across multiple dynasties. The Ming dynasty alone recorded over 40,000 instances of specialized female punishments, each one cataloged with the victim's name, crime, social status, and the specific techniques employed. These weren't random acts of violence, but components of a vast administrative machine designed to maintain social control through terror. The economic dimension added another layer of calculation to female punishment. Women represented valuable property in Imperial China, whether as wives, concubines, or laborers. Simply executing them meant losing that value, so punishments were often designed to extract maximum utility while inflicting maximum suffering. The salt mines of Sichuan province became notorious for their female work gangs, where women sentenced to hard labor were subjected to conditions that guaranteed death within months while maximizing their productive output. The next category of punishments focused on what imperial authorities termed crimes of the spirit, where women were accused of challenging not just earthly authority, but the celestial order itself. Witchcraft accusations could destroy entire family lines, but for the women at their center, the punishments transcended mere physical torture. The imperial courts understood that spiritual crimes required spiritual solutions, punishments that would cleanse the cosmic contamination these women supposedly carried. The Iron Maiden wasn't just a device for killing. It was a purification chamber where the accused witch would be sealed inside with carefully positioned spikes that pierced specific acupuncture points, disrupting what Chinese medicine believed were the body's energy channels. The process could take days, with the victim experiencing waves of agony as her life force was systematically severed. But the true masterpiece of spiritual punishment was the ancestral severing ritual. Chinese society believed that a person's connection to their ancestors was the foundation of their spiritual existence. For women accused of communing with evil spirits or practicing forbidden arts, authorities would perform elaborate ceremonies designed to cut these ancestral ties permanently. The victim would be forced to watch as her family's ancestral tablets were burned, their graves desecrated, and their names struck from genealogical records. Only then would the physical torture begin, because now she was spiritually orphaned, cut off from the protection of her lineage. The water wheel punishment combined drowning with resurrection in cycles that could continue for weeks. Women were strapped to massive wooden wheels that rotated slowly, submerging them in specially designed pools for precise intervals. The timing was critical. Too long underwater meant death. Too short meant insufficient suffering. Masters of this technique could keep victims alive for 30 or 40 cycles, each submersion bringing them to the edge of drowning before pulling them back to consciousness. Survivors reported that the anticipation became worse than the drowning itself, as they could hear the wheel creaking toward the next rotation while gasping for air. For noblewomen, whose crimes carried implications for entire political networks, the punishments incorporated elements of public theater that served multiple functions. The cage of mirrors was constructed specifically for high-ranking women accused of treason or conspiracy. The victim was placed in a cage lined with polished bronze mirrors, then positioned in public squares where crowds could gather. But the mirrors weren't just for humiliation. They created a psychological torture chamber where the victim was forced to confront her own suffering from every angle, unable to escape her own image as she deteriorated over weeks of public display. The silk strangling method was reserved for imperial concubines who had fallen from favor. Unlike quick executions, this process used specially woven silk cords that tightened gradually over hours. The victim remained conscious throughout, feeling her breath slowly constricted while experiencing the irony that the very luxury material that once adorned her was now the instrument of her destruction. Palace records describe how some victims would beg their executioners to use rougher rope, anything that would end their suffering more quickly. Medical torture represented perhaps the most sophisticated category of female punishment in Imperial China. Palace physicians, trained in the intricate knowledge of human anatomy, were sometimes conscripted to design punishments that maximize suffering while avoiding death. The needle maps involved inserting thin metal needles into specific nerve clusters, creating networks of constant pain that could be maintained for months without causing fatal damage. Victims described feeling as though their entire bodies were on fire, but the strategic placement ensured they remained lucid enough to experience every moment of agony. The stretching frames used on women incorporated detailed knowledge of female anatomy to create gender-specific tortures. These devices could separate joints gradually over days, but they were designed with adjustments that targeted the female pelvis and ribcage specifically. The process would render victims unable to walk or bear children, marking them permanently as examples of what happened to women who challenged imperial authority. For crimes involving multiple women, such as organized resistance or large-scale adultery scandals, the authorities developed group punishments that amplified individual suffering through forced participation. The chain gangs weren't just about hard labor. Women were shackled together in configurations that made movement almost impossible, forcing them to coordinate every action while competing for scarce resources. The psychological breakdown that resulted from this forced intimacy, combined with constant deprivation, created a form of collective punishment, where the victims became instruments of each other's torture. The branding ceremonies for female criminals incorporated symbols that told stories of their crimes to anyone who could read the imperial marking system. But these weren't simple marks burned into skin. The brands were applied in sequences over multiple sessions, each one deeper than the last, creating raised scars that would remain visible for life. The symbols themselves were chosen to maximize shame, identifying not just the crime, but the woman's former social status and family connections. The final category of punishments focused on what imperial scholars called crimes of legacy, where women threatened the continuity of bloodlines or challenged the hereditary systems that maintained imperial power. These punishments were designed not just to destroy the individual, but to eliminate her genetic contribution to future generations entirely. The bone-crushing ceremonies followed ancient patterns that targeted specific areas of the female skeleton associated with childbearing capacity. Using weighted hammers and precisely calibrated pressure, executioners would systematically destroy the pelvic structure over multiple sessions, ensuring that even if the victim survived, she could never reproduce. The process was performed in temple courtyards, combining religious ritual with state violence to create an atmosphere where torture became a form of divine judgment. These weren't just punishments. They were blueprints for breaking the human spirit, refined across centuries into instruments of such calculated cruelty that they still haunt the historical record today. Every technique we've explored, from the lingchi to the bone-crushing ceremonies, was designed with one purpose: to transform women's bodies into monuments to imperial power, living warnings etched in flesh and bone. The 12-year-old girl we met in Chang'an's marketplace could never have imagined that her laughter, her footsteps, even her very existence balanced on such a razor's edge. In a world where women were vessels for honor, bloodlines, and cosmic order, the smallest transgression could unleash machinery of suffering so sophisticated it required manuals, specialists, and bureaucratic precision to operate. What makes these punishments truly terrifying isn't just their brutality, it's their logic. These weren't the products of madness, but of minds that approached human suffering with the same methodical care they applied to governance, medicine, and philosophy. They created systems where torture became policy, where breaking women became statecraft, and where the screams of the condemned were transformed into the foundation of social control. The records are there, carved in stone and preserved in imperial archives. 40,000 documented cases in the Ming Dynasty alone. Thousands more across the Tang, Song, and Qing periods. Names, crimes, techniques, and outcomes, all cataloged with the precision of tax records because that's exactly what they were. Accounts of human inventory processed through the empire's most efficient machine. Today we tell ourselves we've evolved beyond such calculated cruelty. But the blueprints remain, waiting in the shadows of history, reminding us that civilization is always one decision away from revealing the monsters it keeps hidden beneath its silk robes and golden ornaments.